Hello, beautiful community. You can hear me, can't you? And you can see me. Let me apologize for being late. Tell me if you can see and hear me. I have had a bit of a brainstem crisis today after trying to reach for a Nietzsche book on the shelf with one of my grabbers. And if you want to watch that, there's a 30-second video of that event on Instagram, after which I couldn't breathe for several hours and struggled to swallow, which I'm still doing a little bit. So you're going to help me swallow. You're going to help me breathe. I'm also going to be helped by some sparkling water and a terrible takeaway coffee in a plastic-free cup, but still terrible takeaway stuff that I wouldn't get unless I was sick. Let's rock and roll, beautiful community. We're going to do our honorifications of people who left comments above, but we're going to be briefer than usual, so we don't sit around outside of the live immediate interaction format for more than 20 minutes or so. Ross, AI might destroy some jobs. Might AI have any positive political effects by providing access to less algorithmically driven information? No. What AI could do is screw us over in a way that's just as bad but different to algorithms. I mean, you're seeing that already. What is an algorithm going to do? It's going to reinforce and intensify what you already think to the point that you begin to think what you didn't think via thinking increasingly more intense versions of the thought you already thought to start with. What Claude or ChatGPT would do is center you in a bogus center. So outside of scientific information, though it can get that pretty wrong too, if you talk to these, things about the humanities, about societal questions, they're going to give you a middle of the road answer. And if you're an expert in the thing you're asking it about, you'll recognize that the middle of the road answer is often prejudicial or inappropriately ideological or evasive. So you're basically going to get a kind of complacent reinforcement of the status quo in a sort of frivolous and evasive way. So that's a different kind of way of bringing out the worst in you. Darren, we've got to spend more on defense at the expense of societal safety nets, you've said, Vlad, causing political tensions. Any chance of a third way, like taxing the wealthy? We've got to find as much room as possible for a third way where you have both, where you get your cake and eat it. But realistically, we're never going to get rid of that conflict. We will undermine trust in democracy the more we spend on defense. The less we spend on defense, the less safe we're going to be from objectively existing threats. So this is genuinely a conflict where each way you choose, you lose. But what I would say is that it's up to the political imagination of leaders to bring it about that we get as much of both as possible. Vlad, you said Russians are responsible for their state's actions. Is an investor responsible for a company's actions? Is it moral to invest in defense? And does necessity make it moral? So necessity makes some things moral, but it doesn't make other things moral. I'll leave the necessity point at that. On investment, you're absolutely responsible, but it's a different kind of responsibility. You're responsible in virtue of your bond and solidarity and national belonging for things your government does. And that's even true if your government is authoritarian. You're not guilty for things your government does, you're responsible. And you're indeed responsible even when you're opposed to what your government is doing. I'm opposed to what my government did in 2002 and in committing to a war in Iraq. I marched against that war. I even organized against that war. But I'm still responsible for the Iraq war as a British citizen. So that's how responsibility works. Don't confuse it with guilt. Now, you are responsible for your investments, yes, but there are degrees of responsibility, shades of responsibility. If you've put yourself into an index fund, that's different to a direct investment in Tesla. So you're going to be very differently responsible, but you are going to be responsible. It's just that you have to have a healthy, non-persecutory relationship with responsibility on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also have to acknowledge that there is responsibility. It's not just something you can wish away. Would relations between Germany and France be under stress if ex-conservative authoritarian parties took power in both countries, like Marine Le Pen and the AfD? These governments would be ideological allies. But being ideological allies doesn't make authoritarian ex-conservative politicians get on. What would in practice be the case is that it would be much more up to the personal relationship between the two leaders. And that's the kind of world we're entering anyway, where individual relationships are going to matter more than the historical inheritance that the country enters into a conflict or negotiation with, or the dense, bureaucratically complex, entrenched position the country has. That's all going to diminish, and individual relationships between leaders are going to be more important, which is the kind of world that Trump and Putin want. So don't confuse ideological alliance, ideological sharing, with the idea that these leaders are necessarily gonna get on. And volunteering, Dave says, for as a support person for a teenager in care, most of the programs he can access are outsourced to private organizations. This marketplace seems problematic to me. Any thoughts? Well, between the private and the public center, we're failing to meet a lot of the basic needs of many groups of our citizens. And certainly citizens with particular kinds of acute chronic illnesses, and also citizens with particular kinds of mental illnesses, are near the top of the list of groups whose needs we're simply failing to meet. Vlad, I often watch your videos, Stepan says, and think, well, I can kind of see the point in what Vlad is saying, but not completely. But since it's Vlad who's making the point, there must be something to it. Am I in an epistemically unhealthy relationship with you? If you freeze that, then you are in an epistemically unhealthy relationship with me. But if that is a stage along a process for you where you constantly re-engage the question of trust, then it's okay. Because over time, where you may be arriving is that you can better make judgments about how trustworthy I am than how epistemically accurate I am on a particular issue. And there's absolutely nothing wrong as long as you keep engaged and reassessing your own position at the level of trust vis-a-vis me. As long as you keep reassessing, then it's entirely reasonable that you have greater epistemic confidence in my trustworthiness than you do in my accuracy on a particular view. And therefore, you leverage your confidence in my trustworthiness to make certain presumptions about possible accuracy on a particular issue. I mean, this is actually going to get a lot more dramatic if I talk explicitly about philosophical issues, right? So if I tell you something about Aristotle's ethical theory, right? We've got 140 of us in the room, which is very nice because that means I can engage with more of your questions. It's nice to have a small number. That's partly why I'm doing this at an unusual time, on an unusual day. Basically, none of you are going to have any clue whether I'm right or wrong if I say something about Aristotle. I mean, you're literally going to be as clueless as though I were speaking a foreign language. Now, what you're going to be left with is the question, what would it take for Vlad to express a view on Aristotle? Like, how slow is Vlad? Is Vlad extraordinarily slow to express a view on Aristotle? Then I'm going to think, well, I'm going to gamble that I don't have to settle on this, but if I were to take a guess, I'd probably guess Vlad's got a point because he's so incredibly slow at forming a view, and his criteria for what it means to express a view about Aristotle are really high, probably to the point that Vlad thinks most professional philosophers aren't qualified to say anything about Aristotle. Or you might think, well, no, actually, this whole business of Vlad being so slow is overestimated. And he's not that slow. And therefore, it's possible that he does say something about Aristotle without knowing what he's talking about. So it's completely reasonable for you to be making these procedural judgments, right? Rather than making direct judgments about the subject matter I'm expressing a view on. And in fact, these procedural judgments are healthy. They are the main judgment you should be making about people. Like, does Michael Ignatieff have any idea what he's talking about? Start with a procedural judgment. Don't start with, Michael's made these 4 claims, let me assess them, and then I'll come to my view. No. Judge the process of how Michael comes to views. You know? You're a fan of Bertrand Russell? Well, think about how he arrived at views, right? You're a fan of Clive James? Think of how he arrived at views. Fan of Iris Murdoch? Think of how she arrived at views. So I absolutely recommend this procedural stuff. Shocked that my family will be voting reform, or has voted reform in the local elections. Sorry, my grandson, who's 25, shocked the family by voting reform in the local elections. His twin sister has effectively disowned him. The rest of us are seeking more positive ways to influence him. Any advice? Don't try to influence his politics. Try to engage with him in the way that will allow him to keep open politically, not close, and not also fall into various kinds of resentment, and not also fall into defining his sense of his identity and tying his self-esteem to his political choice. Help him with all of that. Don't directly try to change his mind. That's not really constructive. You change people's minds by not changing their minds, by engaging with them in meaningful and sincere ways. So that's what I would say. And also understand that this is a process, right? You don't care where you're at 25. You care where you're at across your life politically. So understand that this is a journey, and some of the journey you won't get to see, some of it you will get to see. So that's it. Yeah, I don't see room for how dare you. What I do see room is maybe for a political conversation, but that depends on the personalities involved, that detaches, this is the only political point I would make, the grievances and concerns he has from the vehicle he has selected to advance them. So it might be that you recognize all of his concerns as valid, but you can maybe make the case that the vehicle he has chosen are a bunch of incompetent charlatans. So even if all the concerns they claim they stand for are all correct, they ain't going to deliver on them, right? Jamie, historically, British duty meant deference and punitive coercion. No, it's meant that, but it's also meant some wonderful liberal things, some wonderful things to do with self sacrifice. So, no, I mean, that's a little bit of corrosive. It's both positive and negative. Is this authoritarian streak a fixture of our political psyche that reemerges during crisis? This is not the worry you got now. The worry you've got now is that the entire sense of duty is being washed away. We're going liquid, right? Our societies are going liquid. Things are being washed away. And so depoliticization is a much bigger worry than the worry that there is a particular institutionalized culture of duty that's deleterious and will be badly exploited. Um, I don't say that's not a worry, but I'm saying there's a priority here. And the priority is that um, worrying that relating with a sense of duty to institutions is going to get washed away is a bigger worry than destructive forms of duty outweighing constructive forms of duty. As a father of two boys, aged 3, and a newborn, what things, 3991, is asking, in particular, do you think I should focus on trying to teach and show them to prepare them to thrive in the future? I'm in the West. The most important thing you can do for them is A, to be the least effed up version of yourself that you can be. Same goes for the mum. So being as free and as real and as happy as you guys can be is the biggest thing you can give your kids. Then when we specifically talk about your kids, there's a lot. Number one, it's very important that children have a healthy relationship with frustration, and that frustration can become a site of curiosity and exploration and not a site for intolerance and not being able to bear it. It's only if that's got right in an individual's psychology that they can grow. Our culture mitigates against having an adequate relationship with frustration. You've got to understand that it's incredibly important for your children to bear being frustrated and to be able to experience frustration as conducive to exploration and growth. That's the universal truth, but it's especially true in a culture that A is very individualistic and authenticity driven, and B in a culture that denies frustration, that wants to pretend that frustration is not part of human life, number one. Number two, this is really a very big separate conversation, but confidence is incredibly important. It's incredibly important to be confident. And you are confident if you receive love in a certain way. I'm not going to elaborate on that now. If you don't, you can still give yourself confidence later on, but that requires a lot of work. understand that fundamentally much more important than teaching something to your children, you have to develop a relationship where the two of you, the four of you, can dance with one another, where you can bring your personalities to your relationship and play and explore. And you can't say, this is what I need to teach my children. What you need to teach your children is something that is going to be a product of that kind of exploratory relationship you have, because you're going to have to discover their personalities, and respecting their personalities and them respecting your personality meet. And of course, also engage in conflict playfully and healthily. Of course, there is so much more to say, but that frustration point is very important, as is the related point that making them feel that what they want is very important to you, even if they don't get what they want. Right. Book recommendations, yes, 99962. I've got a website. I'm going to do an email list soonishly. When I do it, I'm going to send out book recommendations, also maybe put some on my website. Decisive 77, is it ever appropriate or effective to fight a fake grievance campaign with a manifesto of genuine complaint? Negative politics often seem to favor the most dishonest. Have I misunderstood? I'm not quite sure I follow your question. Fight a fake grievance campaign for a good cause? I think I'm not understanding you. If that's the question, the answer is no, you don't do that. Because how you advance a grievance is very important, and advancing a real grievance in a bad way can retard the grievance. All right. Let's say we've done our in advance questions, beautiful community. So let's rock and roll into the live. Let's rock and roll into the live. Yeah, decisive. Your question about methods and campaigns and whatever else, just re-ask it so that I get it. Maybe I'm being dumb today. Rachel is doing Pilates. I'm jealous. When will JD Vance ever say anything worth sharing? Well, because of his power, what he says is all too often worth sharing. Hannah from Israel, hi to you. I can order a high quality coffee. It's just not going to arrive high quality. And because I've recently stopped making my own coffee for health reasons, I have got these terrible takeaway cups, even though I get ones that don't have any plastic in them. It's still not good. I wouldn't get them if I weren't sick. Why is it that intellectual people get so much more of classical music as compared to modern music? Well, first of all, classical music is also modern. There is classical music being written today. Some of it is terrible, some of it is good. In other words, this is a cultural misconception. There is classical music written in the 1980s, like Ligetis etudes. That's on the level of some of the works of important 19th century composers like Chopin and Schumann. So it's at a greater distance from common cultural consciousness, but that doesn't actually mean it's not part of the culture. It's just part of the culture in an elite way. And that's unfortunate. Now, I am in a city where there is greater capacity to grasp that kind of art expression. London is crap at it, but crap is very good by international standards. So that's the first thing. Classical music is modern, it's still being produced. So then the question is, why do some people get more out of classical music than other kinds of music? Well, it depends what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to pop music, then the difference is that one is expressive and the other is non-expressive entertainment, right? When you have, let's say, Elvis Presley, right? What you've got is not expression. You've got symbolization, right? So what Beethoven is going to give you is tenderness. What Elvis is going to give you is the idea of tenderness rather than tenderness itself. And that means that one is a transformational experience and the other is a non-transformational entertainment experience. One changes you, the other becomes a background to whatever state you are in, and you remain in that state. So there's a difference of transformation. Now, you could say that there's a lot of gray space. How do you categorize the blues traditions, for instance? How do you categorize a lot of jazz? How do you categorize a lot of folk music? Then you've got to deal with the fact that a lot of pop performers are much better than professional classical musicians, right? Nina Simone has greater rhythmical strength than the vast majority of famous pianists. And she is better at characterizing than the vast majority of famous pianists. So that's another complicating factor. And there is also entertainment, and there is entertainment. There is entertainment that then does begin to have, I'm going back on myself a little bit, a transformational quality. So that's how that conversation would develop. But what you can't say, I'm sorry, is that there are just different genres and that there's Bob Dylan and there is Beethoven and they're just different. No, I'm sorry. Beethoven is 4,000 times more profound than Bob Dylan, even if one likes Bob Dylan a lot. So we also got to cut the crap and call it as it is, right? Just because there's a preference for something that's more common doesn't mean that it has equivalent sophistication and equivalent depth, right? There is nothing that the greatest pop artist of the 20th century, who I would probably say is Nina Simone, has produced that could be comparable to a performance of Beethoven's late string quartets by the Bush Quartet, right? So a little bit of healthy perspective and healthy elitism is also going to have a place here. That doesn't mean that everybody's got to be interested in classical music, not at all. What it does mean is if there is room for that in your life, for that kind of thing, find something of that kind that's yours. It could be painting, it could be some kind of art expression, God knows what. It doesn't have to be music. There's nothing wrong with leading a life and never listening to classical music. Nothing wrong at all. And indeed, there is nothing wrong with not engaging with any art form at all during your life. Human beings are complicated. Human beings are multifaceted. And certain kinds of special relationships with certain things crowd out other relationship with certain things, right? In a life full of a connection with nature and full of a great deal of physical activity, like walking and hiking, there may be no space in that life for art. That's okay, right? Um, that a lot of people have a very deep relationship with politics who don't have a single aesthetic bone in their body. That's completely okay. So we also got to appreciate that. Um, Hinik says, Vlad, I hard disagree with your Hasan Piker take. Well, my Hasan Piker take is not about what Hasan said or didn't say. It's about whether he should be allowed into the UK, which he certainly should. So that's the first point. The second point, why are you telling me that you disagree with me? Like, am I your mum? Right? I'm not here for you to agree with me. What kind of interest is there in the fact that we disagree? That's excellent if we disagree. There's no problem. You're not here to agree with me. Um, if you are here to agree with me, I want you to agree with me because you found your way to a view that happens to overlap with mine. I'm giving you some procedural things, right? But why would I want you to agree with me? Um, Now, I'm being, of course, a little bit mean, but the reason I'm being mean is I constantly get this email, a kind of a clarification email. Oh, by the way, Vlad, you've said 74 things. 4 of them I actually don't share with you. Well wishes, Larry, Barry, or Harry. Larry, thank you so much for pointing out you disagree with 4 things out of the 77 I mentioned, and just so great to have you with me next year. Hey, Vlad, just to say there's actually 2 more things I've disagreed with you this year. Just going to list them below, by the way. Best wishes, Larry. Larry, thanks so much for letting me know that you disagree with 2 more things I've said. That's terrific. And it's also terrific you agree with most of the other things I've said, so that's great. Right? We're not we're not doing that, right? We're not doing that. We're not here to agree. Malfitano, thank you so much for facilitating us. I was convinced you would be uh, in bed on your time zone. I'm sorry not to even tell you we were doing a live. Didn't expect to see you. Oh, Heinik tells her, by the way, I've just got a call that you've got some different views about different things, and I don't know what they are, but I bet I disagree with some of them. So I just want to share that with you, that you've got lots of views, but actually I might disagree with some of them, and I want you to know that, you know? Um, Hey, Vlad, what's your opinion on cordon sanitaires in European democracies? Presumably that's about keeping parties you regard as unconstructive out of politics. This is difficult, and it's going to have to be responsive to local political culture, because what you don't want to do is artificially narrow the range of permissible debate, because that's actually only going to put fuel on the fire of authoritarian populism. Because what populism is in the way that John Gray uses the term, not me. I use it in terms of discourse and the bridging of public discourse with private sentiment. But the way John would use it would be along the lines of populism being backlash against the counterproductive and destructive and restrictive policies of liberal centrism over the last couple of decades. And in that sense, if you continue to insist on some of the barriers that generated the very problem you've got, then you're going to be in trouble. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have to demand that people respect the democratic game, that people are constitutional. And that reminds me, I think I missed a question above. I'm going to check once again. So this is going to be a very difficult balance to strike. How you strike it is going to be dependent on local political culture. I am of the view tendentiously that you've got to be very slow with the idea of designating certain political forces, even if they're irresponsible, as being beyond the circle of permissible participation, because I think that's going to be counterproductive, and you've got to make a lot of citizens feel like you're gaslighting them. But this is a conflict. There is no sort of easy solution here. I think there was a question on institutions, and I was looking at it, and then I lost it. Let me see if it's right at the top. Yes, I've lost the question, but I remember what it is. The question was, is the fact that institutions usually seek consensus a problem in an age of distrust where you have to show people that you can get things done? And the answer is that actually institutions don't seek consensus in a democracy typically. What they seek is a certain procedural way of handling conflict. What they seek is the idea that, yes, we can conflict within the institution and between institutions, but there are certain principles that mean that the conflict is not going to get existential. Right? It's going to be the conflict of a game of tennis where there is genuine competition, but the competition does not become a sort of war of all against all, where rackets get thrown across the court. So that's the risk. The risk today is that institutions lose the capacity to arbitrate conflict without the conflict becoming conflict between not opponents, but conflict between enemies. That's a problem. And that's a very difficult issue about which we'll speak more. Benjamin is asking about book recommendations. I'm a political science student. What do you recommend? Look, if you're a political science student, read Charles Taylor's 1971 essay on social sciences and the interpretation of man. I will have emails and website blah 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 with book recommendations in the near future, because I want that to be available. The Cunning of Unreason is a very good 25-year-old book by John Donne. That's a general introduction to politics that matters. Read or listen to some Alistair McIntyre. If you want a more casual and conversational voice that's very contemporary, you could read Jason Blakely. who has written quite a bit about the pathologies of the sorts of things that happen in political science departments. Understand that if you're in America, you're at bigger risk of scientism in a political science department. I mean, I, as a postgrad at Oxford 20, 25 years ago, met quite a bit of scientism. But luckily, I took a wonderful course with Alan Ryan on the philosophy of the social sciences. So also just Google Alan Ryan and the philosophy of the social sciences. There's a book that I think is edited by Alan Ryan. It's a collection of essays on this from decades back. It's also worth grabbing. And of course, you need something to reflect on democratic decline. Charles Taylor is strong on that, and there's a book I tend to recommend. I forget what it's called. It's a book of essays on. It's called Democratic Regeneration or Democratic Degeneration and Regeneration, something like that. Enough. Of course, I would also say, for goodness sake, stay close to the great texts. Don't allow yourself to be bogged down in, little essays written in the 1960s or the 1990s. Have some kind of relationship with Hobbes, Machiavelli, Thucydides. Why is it I never find the question Vlad answers here in the chat? Six Brotsling, don't know. You can try. You can try me by asking a question of your choosing. The smaller the group, the more chances I answer. If you email me at the Get in Touch with Vlad address, I have an existent answering rate, but it's small because I'm overwhelmed. If you're finding that it's very significant for you that I answer a question, my recommendation is to email me 3 times once a month with the same question. I won't experience that as spam. Ukraine question. Vlad, any advice for someone joining combat soon? Have largely made peace with death, but not life-altering injuries. How does one deal with that fear? Thank you. It's very difficult for us to sacrifice ourselves for our country. Which is why when Russia attacked Ukraine, and Ukraine is a European country that we can to a degree relate to in the West, a lot of Westerners thought, what the hell is that? Why are they defending themselves? Why aren't they shopping? So this is very, very difficult for us. And the reason it's difficult for us is in part because more than any humans who have lived before us, we feel that we are entitled to get what we want from our lives. If we listen to the Morse code messaging of the Titanic, what's so haunting about it in 1912 is that it's in between a world where people are modern in that sense that they expect life to give them what they want, and not yet modern, that they have an expectation of reconciling to life not giving them what they want. And that means they have a very different relationship than we would have, in some respects at least, with this extraordinary tragedy that was happening to them on the 14th of April, 1912. So that's one thing. It's very, very difficult for us to go on as though we're okay with not getting what we want from life. I don't do war because of my privilege, but I am significantly ill and significantly disabled, right? I couldn't reach a bookshelf earlier with a grabber. I've got significant microvascular damage. That's life giving me something I didn't ask for. It's life giving me something I don't want. So integration for you would mean accepting, but acceptance is a dance, and acceptance comes with refusal to accept, and acceptance comes with the balance of acceptance and refusal to accept. But it means accepting that life can give you something you don't want, and therefore going to war is not a cessation of your life, but a part of your life too. It's just life giving you something you don't want. Even if you want to go and fight, you don't want to go and fight in the sense that you don't want the bloody war. So integration means accepting that this is not just a complete break in your life, but that it is part of your life. If something radical happens to you, you can't prepare for that in advance. And you have to understand that when big things happen to human beings, it normally takes probably about a year and a half before that thing is properly percolated. So let's say losing a couple of limbs significantly, right? It's going to take a human a year and a half to sort of process that. If you receive a significant limitation on your life as a result of being wounded, it is going to be an exploration what it means to live with that. And you're actually going to end up surprised by both what is difficult, but also what is possible. When we are limited, the limitation might be fixed. Let's say somebody doesn't have 2 legs, but what is possible for them isn't fixed. It might be that they thought they couldn't work like that, but they suddenly discover they can. I mean, look at me. I'm working. I can't even sit in a wheelchair for more than half an hour on some days, but I'm working. Now, if I thought of work as I have to be in an academic philosophy department 9 to 5, or I can't do anything, then work would be impossible for me, right? So it's an exploration what is possible, even when we have a very, very fixed limit. And then, of course, under conditions of war, you're going to have a certain shedding of skin, a certain kind of reduction of yourself to something more like your animal nature. And also, there's going to be something exhilarating about that. And it's going to be important to not get off on that too much either, because there is going to be an element of sort of looking under the carpet of existence. And one of the problems a lot of people who come back from war feel actually is that life is not radical and existential enough. And so everything feels gray. So I think it's important to be open to what might happen, not over catastrophize it, but catastrophize it to a degree, and get yourself prepped for being ready to respond and grow through different scenarios so that you're not in complete denial about the possibilities, and that if one of them occurs, um, you have at least begun to direct yourself at a mental and physiological level toward preparing yourself uh, for them. Another thought that helps is just humans in history. Humans have been through a lot of crap in history. Humans deal with a lot of stuff in history, and we can learn a lot from their capacity to sustain hope and their resilience. Obviously, I'm sorry that the bloody Ruskies are causing this needlessly. We've got a lot of completely needless human suffering in the world. What question would someone who is thinking about going into politics ask themselves? I think I have the skills for it, but I think I would find it too frustrating to be effective. You need to ask questions about your capacity. You need to ask questions about specifically your leadership capacity, even if you're not going to be a leader of any party. And you need to ask yourself ethical questions about how you can maintain your ethical radar while having dirty hands. Politics is a dirty business. Politics is a business of compromise. Politics is a business of alliances that are semi palatable to get results that are preferable. Right? Certain people are primed for that, others aren't. Right? I have no interest in politics myself, for instance. If I were healthy, not I'd be any good at it, but I have no interest in it at all. Partly because I am not interested in the enormous amount of harm that a constructive and benign political leader at a high level of power will inevitably have to induce. Hussein, what led to wokeism going away so quickly? It was like yesterday people were trying to cancel Beethoven. It was such a powerful movement that it felt it wouldn't go away. Did people suddenly collectively come to their senses? No. So wokeism, hyper-identity politics, which is roughly when you make political disagreement moral, make moral disagreement about identity, and make identity disagreement something you want to enshrine institutionally, right? When you do that, you're being toxic. Why are people doing less of that? Why? Because this gone down. It's partly gone down because there is a counter-revolutionary authoritarian wave coming to wash it away. So we're replacing the, if you like, apolitical authoritarian tendencies of certain middle-class elites, which is roughly what wokeism is sociologically, with the more politically ambitious, partly fascistized authoritarian tendencies of these ex-conservative politicians. So the problem now is that anti-woke is worse than what woke was. Anti-woke is normatively impeccable as a position, but what I'm saying is in practice, 98% of anti-woke is now authoritarian. And so we're now going to have institutions tilting from woke to complicity with Orban-type politicians. Today, wokeism is still dominant. I would say it's gone from 8 out of 10 to 3 out of 10, and it's going to be at 1 and at 0. The biggest challenge is how do we protect the groups that wokeism most vehemently advocated for in a counterproductive way, right? Ethnic minorities, trans people, different groups who are still partly or in some cases wholly clinging to wokeism as a vehicle of advocacy, whereas in fact it's digging their graves politically, right? So that's a very dangerous position. And we need to change and to do more politically effective advocacy for groups that are still trying to be woke and self-advocacy. Well, it's going to undermine them eventually. It's a recipe for political defeat. So don't do it. But it's not gone down because people came to their senses. It went down because there's a counterweighing political wave, and people who were quiet but unhappy with wokeism are now feeling freer to stand up, and they're getting less backlash. Wokeism was never a majority position. Most UK humanities academics were always non-woke, even at the height of wokeism. They just kept quiet. They just thought this is embarrassing and ridiculous, but I'll be quiet because they'll try to cancel me unless I say the particular words they want me to say, right? So it's not gone away for sort of epistemically constructive reasons. It's got washed away. Is Scott Ritter believable? Not no. I mean, he's believable as a sort of propagandist. What's your Myers-Briggs? I am ENFP. I am E marginal. I'm a bit more extroverted than introverted, but it's close. The reason I'm extroverted is not because I love all the attention. It's because, obviously, apart from my health, which is a physical reason that I can't do certain activities, but at a psychological level, socializing doesn't drain me, which is a very key feature of introversion. Socializing never drains me emotionally. But then that's how I'm extroverted. But then I'm introverted in the sense that I could spend 2 years not talking to a human being and remain stable, just do a bit of philosophy. Then on the second letter, I am much more N than S, which you'd be surprised by because you'd think philosophers are analytical, but I'm about 92%, 90%, sometimes 88%, it sort of swings if I redo it, intuitive. And that's even how I do philosophy. I'm much more intuitive than analytical. Then I am, by a smaller margin, feeling over thought, maybe like 60-40. Again, you'd be surprised by this if you have certain conventional prejudices about, philosopher, analytical. And then on the end, I am P. I have quite a bit of J. I think this is how there's certain ways that I want the world to look. But of course, as a philosopher, I'm P. Of course, as a philosopher, I'm P because I look at the way things are. Number one. Only number two do I want to rearrange the world. Number one, I look at the world. Okay. And then also, if you add the extra bit about assertiveness, I used to be 97% assertive, and that feels too high, so I'm trying to get myself back to 90. My friend Katerina is not watching, but she's committed to getting me down to 90 so that I'm a bit less assertive. What qualities to build to become a more independent thinker? How do you train yourself to be an original thinker rather than just repeating other great minds? So there are 246 people in this room. It's possible that one of you could be an original thinker, but it's highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. So to be an original thinker, you have to be at least a low-level genius. What you want is to be a free thinker, not an original thinker. You have to be an independent thinker who can think for yourself, right? And then you have to be mature about what it means to have an original thought. Having an original thought is difficult, right? If you stop 400 people on the street, the chances are very low that any of them can think originally about anything of significance, except for personal things in their life, right? So we don't aim for that. If you're an original thinker, you should probably be a professional thinker, quite frankly. Otherwise, you'd be wasting your talent. So what you want is to make sure that you don't swim about being essentially at the mercy of not just what the crowd thinks, but what the crowd thinks in this algorithmically mediated way. Read chapter 3 of John Stuart Mill's on liberty. I mean, let me try to give you a quote. Let me see if I can find the quote, because I've got brain fog. I normally can recall it, but I can't. Due to public opinion, chapter 3 on liberty. Let's see if we can get it. I'm going to give 30 seconds to myself, otherwise I'm going to give up. Yeah, I can't find it for some reason, but and my brain is too weak to reproduce it at the moment verbatim by memory. So what you want is, I beg your pardon for this waste of time. What you want is to not be this kind of algorithmic bot that I often warn us against being, who basically gets tantalized by sellotaping themselves to a particular group position, an algorithmically mediated group position. You don't want to do that. And partly, I think my answer is going to be, I'm going to do a workshop on something like this. How to go on online is going to be just in itself an important part of this. Another part here is that you've got to have some kind of constructive dialogue offline about important issues of politics. And if you don't have anybody um, to do this with, you have to do it with yourself inside your own head. It's essential that you don't identify with your political positions, right? So, for example, if you were a NAFO, be careful, right? Because NAFO would be training your brain to latch on to a set of pre-prescribed commitments and positions, which infuse your identity. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with being in NAFO, but you've got to have that self-awareness. Try to always procedurally give an evaluation to yourself of your own capacity to judge something, right? Do I even need to get into this? Do I even have an opinion about this? How good is my opinion on this going to be given my level of familiarity with it? So I'm still trying to find the Mill quote. I have no idea why I'm being so slow with it. All right. That'll do for that. Let me get a little bit more concentrated and sharp so that we stop blubbering around. How would Westerners cope psychologically if their countries were invaded like Ukraine, ignoring nukes? Not well, but war concentrates the mind. Don't forget, Ukraine is pre-war a society that's got quite a lot on Russia politically. It's got lots of political and civic myths and values tangibly expressed in culture that are about challenging authority. But before the war, Ukraine is a civically disengaged, heavily neoliberal, heavily depoliticized, very low trust society. Ukraine is a lower trust society than the UK before the full-scale invasion. So understand that war concentrates the mind, but that when the war stops, the same patterns come back again, right? These social forces that we're all victims of, Ukraine is again going to be a victim of when the war stops. So what I would say is we may have done a bit worse than Ukraine, but don't over-romanticize the difference and understand that lots of patterns will recur after the war stops, difficult patterns that make democracy hard to sustain. And don't dramatize that gap between us and Ukrainians. Probably could be a bit of a gap. Would be worse. But I wouldn't over dramatize it because of the way war concentrates the mind. But also don't underestimate how many Ukrainians also just don't want to fight, right? They don't want to be there. So understand that there's a complexity of reaction. There's deep diversity and pluralism in Ukraine, right? Ukraine is not a cartoon. It's a real country with real people. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's a very useful thing to over exaggerate this story. Oh my God, look at these Ukrainians. If only we were a quarter like them, we'd be okay. No, that's not how it works. Is it wrong or dangerous to be completely unaware or indifferent to one's personality type? If you mean something like the Myers-Briggs personality type, no, it's not wrong or unaware to be completely indifferent to it. It's just a tag that doesn't explain much. It's just a useful shorthand to help you get on with people. But is psychic, psychoanalytic, psychological understanding of yourself in general important? Yes, it is, right? Because partly living life well means understanding life, and understanding life means understanding yourself. How is disability different or similar to the experience of aging? It's nothing like the experience of aging in the scheme of things. It's much more horrific and violent and scary and unpleasant, except for aging just short of death. And terminal disease processes, the end of life could be worse, but they're probably even going to be better. The kind of disability I have on research studies has been um, shown. If you average out all the patients, some of them are so severe they don't tolerate any light, any touch, and so on. They have to be tube fed, but also they're suffering and all that. They're just in the state of cessation. But I mean, that's not comparable to aging at all. And studies show that my disease, especially if you consider the most severe people, although now I have another disease, I have long COVID, which is for me even worse than near me because it's stopping me from standing at all. But studies show that it's worse than most forms of cancer and most forms of heart disease and most um, uh, of the common big illnesses up until a couple of weeks out from death. So the degree to which people with ME suffer is extreme. So they would rightly be deeply offended if you compared it to aging. That's a sort of a mellow and quaint comparison that just sort of, you know, converts a storm into slightly choppy waters. War is a much better analogy, right? Amalfitano is very, very sick. So she, and I'm sorry, it's not disrespectful to say that she is at war. She's not at war. She is at home, but she is. Uh, it's war. That's a much better analogy, and the violence of it, and the visceralness of it, and is much more that than aging. So like night and day difference. What do you think of the idea Richard is saying that psychic juvenility, immaturity, is a source of many political and social problems? Yes, as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips likes to say, the inducements into adulthood are very impoverished in our society. Our models of happiness are essentially the models of children. So we lack the language for adult fulfillment properly in our societies. Um, and so it's not that humans can be suddenly immature. It doesn't happen at the level of sort of their deep psychological structure. At that level, we're roughly the same as humans 1,000 years ago. But what our culture can do is suppress and express different bits of us. And uh, we are encouraged to live as though our happiness needs were the happiness needs of children, even though the happiness needs we have are the happiness needs of adults. And the central expression of that is the unbelievable evasion of, of the issue of death in our society. The unbelievable evasion of it. A lot of our self help culture is people being on the run from death. What you want instead is to live as long as you can, the healthiest life you can, uh, in an accumulative way. That if you are lucky enough, you get to a place where you say, now it would not be inappropriate to go, right? Do you understand psychopathy, sociopathy? How do you understand its size? TV is asking. Is there a way to know if oneself, an example of it? So, you asking about it decreases the chances that you are it, but doesn't eliminate the chances that you are it, right? Um, who is this? Um, the biggest narcissism YouTube commentator? Oh, for goodness sake! Um, yeah, I've got a brain block about everything today. Um, Sam Vaknin, yeah, Sam Vaknin says, "Let me tell you about narcissism as a narcissist." So that doesn't rule it out. If you ask the question and you are one, does being one prevent you from recognizing you're one? No, no, it doesn't. But of course, back to Ross's question, of course, some disabilities are like aging. Some disabilities are gentle and sort of delimiting in a particular respect. Others are violent. That's why we make this distinction between chronic illness and acute chronic illness. Okay, let's see if there are any super thanks, super chats, whatever they're called. Okay. I'm not fond of romantic music, but very fond of classical and modernist. Can you explain my taste? Mario is asking. Mario, you could try some different list. Maybe you've been hearing the wrong performances. Try to listen to Wilhelm Kempf playing Liszt on the piano, see what that does for you. Listen to Kempf playing the two legends, not from the 70s, but from the 1950s recording. Beyond that, there's nothing wrong with that preference. I do think that if you have a relationship with classical music, there are certain composers you just can't do without. So if you tell me I need to do without Liszt and Wagner, I could just about begin to accept that in the way I couldn't accept if you told me I want to do without Beethoven, Mozart, or Bach, or Haydn. That would be too much. It's a bit like saying I prefer houses without roofs. I mean, we could just about get there, but it'd be weird. But these are people who are obviously essential for me because I have a relationship with musical language as it evolves. That's very important to me. But I do think that there's a difference between an emission of Beethoven and an emission of Wagner. You can have an adequate relationship with that particular musical language without having a relationship with Wagner, the way you probably couldn't if you had no relationship with Bach. But I know I can't explain because I would need to understand exactly how this works for you, and I can't just by you describing what you like and what you don't like without me knowing why. Have we reached a point where only a major catastrophe can bring countries together, or do you see a credible path toward renewed cooperation? There is no credible path, Johnny, toward renewed cooperation through serious crisis, but there can be elements of this, right? So we can say, hey, China, we're America. These are two really big threats that AI poses this century. They could become existential. Let's work together. So it could be partial cooperation like that. But overall, um, could catastrophe bring us together? Well, actually, catastrophe caused by us wouldn't. The only kind of catastrophe that would bring us together is a catastrophe of something like an asteroid impact, which could happen, or alien invasion, which is theoretically interesting because then it would elicit, uh, as Bernard Williams argues in his lecture, A Human Prejudice, it would elicit our sense of species identity because we do have a latent sense of species identity. It comes out in things like if you had to save a human baby or 15 gorillas, you'd save the human baby, even though the gorillas are limitlessly sophisticated, uh, experience pain, and you know are incredibly remarkable in all kinds of ways. You'd save the human baby because they're human. If you started going utilitarian on this, you'd have to save the 15 gorillas probably. You'd need that species identity, and contrary to what Peter Singer would tell us, it is there and it is appropriate and it will get activated and you'll save the baby. That will be dramatically activated if there were an external threat, non-humanly generated threat. But that's pretty much it. That's the kind of crisis we'd need to elicit species-wide identity. Why do I feel like a lot of American Christians have become ex-Christian in the way they interpret their religion, similar to ex-conservatives? I think Jason Blakely, again, is good on this. Follow him on Twitter or wherever you are. He's a philosopher of the younger generation who's written a couple of good books. Roughly, that's true. I think that's a good thought. I think you should stay with that thought. I think you should explore that thought. And that's all I'm going to say for today. What's the role, Hussein is asking, of decline in belief in the situation that it's very difficult for Westerners to sacrifice themselves for a greater good? If you don't believe in God or the afterlife, then living as long as possible makes common sense. That's a product of the social forces that are generating a situation where people might not be so keen to fight for their country. It's not the cause. In other words, the sorts of things that are causing it are the sorts of things that are causing the decline in belief, not the other way around. You see, you've got a consequence you're confusing with the cause here. The causes are various forms of liquidity in our society, diffusion, and also various forms of reflectiveness, asking more and more questions that can't be unasked. So the decline in religious belief is itself the result of that rather than the cause of it. What I'd also invite you to think is that the key thing here is not actually how many fewer people believe in God, but how much more secular the people who still believe in God are. That's important. And there's a beautiful book that discusses that called A Secular Age from 2004 by Charles Taylor. It's one of the two best books of philosophy of social philosophy in the 21st century. Sam, I'm an American. Since 2001, I've seen us leverage our global empire in unproductive and unethical ways, but also in some ethical ways, perhaps support for Ukraine, right? Would it be irrational or unethical to advocate for the dismantling of our empire? No, it wouldn't be unethical or irrational. Um, it might be wrong, but it's not unethical or irrational. It's going to be well rationally supported. I disagree with you. I think that there are certain things that we can't solve without the projection of US power, certain problems we can't solve. We can't solve the Ukraine conflict really without the projection of US power. But the problem is that we can't do anything about the decline of US capacity to project its power, which is what we're witnessing now. And therefore, we have to adjust to a world without uh, the global projection of US imperial power of the kind we're used to. We have to get used to that world. And that's the pattern we've got to respond to it. In other words, you're kind of too late with your conversation. You're sort of 10, 20 years out of date. The issue is that the empire is dismantling itself, and it's not doing so in a constructive way. It's self-immolating. It's absolutely devastating its own state capacity. Like, look at what it did to USAID, for example. It didn't just cause a diffuse global humanitarian catastrophe. This is what these fools did. Doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with USAID. Doesn't mean that none of the criticisms of it were valid, but that's what they've generated in practice, and a collapse in US soft power as well. So the empire is dismantling itself, and we're living through the consequences of it. So you're too late, as it were, with that question. It's about, can we make that dismantling be less bumpy and less destructive? Predabot says, I feel like lots of people would die to protect a certain amount of people they love. The big problem in our world is that we've got a collapse of thin bonds and a retention of thick bonds. Thick bonds are roughly bonds to people you physically interact with and know, your family, your close friends, so on. Thin bonds are bonds you have with either human strangers or perhaps just members of your society. And what we've got is a complete collapse of those relative to recent historical memory. And that's a real problem, because it's really humans going on as though others don't exist, unless the others are people they love or at least care about in a personal capacity. Which means we've got a collapse of what, from what was already a low level of good will toward the public good to, in some dimensions, almost zero goodwill in relation to the public good. And you just can't sustain democracies with that. You just can't. I'm looking, I'm looking, I'm looking. I'm not frozen. We know how can I, as an adult, dependent on parents because of illness, but not yet diagnosed, with a MAGA mum with algorithmic thinking and relatively isolated, survive and develop intellectually as well as a well person? It's a challenge. And I'm so sorry that you're that sick and dependent on your parents. It depends on how sick you are. Like, can you read? Can you listen? Do you tolerate screens? These are all really important questions. But the fact that you're here suggests you have a degree of independent capacity to negotiate the informational environment. So that's already very, very positive. The relationship of dependence is very difficult. It's very toxic because you can't um, because you can't differentiate yourself appropriately from your parents by creating distance and separateness in a healthy way. I'd strongly recommend staying out of politics with them if there are differences, and I'd focus above all on sort of educating them on the basic needs of your illness so that these are as met as best as they can and understood as best as they can. Your engagement with other ill people is already going to get a bit political because it's going to touch on obviously research funding, political investment. It's going to touch on the politics of the medical profession, blah, blah, blah. So you're already involved in a community that is in a very existential way politically discursive. There's just far too much to say. What I would say is, in your least sick moments, try to fly and try to grow. And don't beat yourself up about whatever happens in your more sick moments. But in your less sick moments, try to play, try to grow, try to be outward, even if that's from bed. And understand that the pressure on you to build yourself the right information environment online is 5x than that on other people in this group who are healthy because they have real life and you largely don't, right? You're going to be confined to your bedroom to whatever degree you are, to your bed to whatever degree you are. And so you especially need to have systems for how your online world works. And you've got to have systems whereby even if some of your interaction with the internet is unconstructive or sort of junky or destructive, you've got to have systems to have magical experiences online. One way I recommend doing that is creating walls. So, for example, I am planning to start a classical music channel a little bit soon, health allowing, but I'm in that channel engaging with content. So what happens is when I log into that channel, the algorithm doesn't recommend me anything that's not classical music. So I've created a wall. So when I'm there, I'm not going to see Tucker Carlson. I'm not going to see dog videos. I'm just going to see that. So I've created a wall. So one way to do that on Twitter, for example, is to create lists. So I have lists, for example, on God knows what. I have lists on Iran. I have lists on Iran, which just contain Iran experts. If I log on to that list, I'm not going to see Ricky 77749 expressing an opinion. In fact, I'm not going to see anybody saying anything about Iran who hasn't written a book about Iran. So these subdivisions are very important. And then you can have some spaces online where it's junky junk, and you're watching pig videos. And I do that. I watch pig videos on Instagram. There's a pig called Rosie, who's my favorite pig on Instagram. That's completely okay. But you've got to be much more creative, much more imaginative in the way you use the internet, because in many ways it's closer to being everything you've got for you, right? And in many ways, a lot of people can learn from folks like you, who are much more confined to the online world, about how to organize their online world. Because I've got to say there is still an incredible amount of magic in the internet, and actually, given how ill you are, it'd be so much worse if this was 1990. So you're very lucky to have this, but you've got to make it work for you. What I would say is, intellectually, as sick as you are, it's possible, always possible, to grow. And so a good litmus test is, unless you've had a really terrible month, there's no pressure to grow. But if you're having a semi-tolerable month where you've got a range of functioning, even if it's from bed, is it possible to grow just a couple of millimeters? You've recognized that your thinking is less restricted in some dimension, or you've discovered something different that enriches your sense of an important topic you care about. Blah, 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 right? Grow. I'll be talking more on the ME Diary channel about growing while being very ill. Bia, you're my favorite YouTuber. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much. What were you looking up in Nietzsche's books? So I was planning to release a video, which I won't now tomorrow, but hopefully soon, on this quote unquote Russian slavery gene. Of course, there is no such thing, but there's such a thing as, and in fact, there's a bit of a fascistized label, but there is such a thing as fatalism and extraordinary recourse to passivity in Russian culture, relatively to other cultures. Certainly relatively to Western cultures. But at the same time, also, a lot of Russian passivity is actually ubiquitous. It's just part of the universal stuff that's produced by social forces that affect all of us. All of this needs to be distinguished. But in there, I want to say something about what's wrong with this kind of appeal to willpower and appeal to kind of keeping our nerve when it comes to fighting for our democracies. And that risks um, relying on a kind of bogus will to power attitude to politics where you ask for the impossible, um, where you can't bear accepting the limitations of social conditions. So I wanted to look something up in um, the gay science, toward the end of the gay science, where Nietzsche talks about a kind of defensive optimism that's a product of not being able to accept reality. And I'll mention that in the video when I connect Russian passivity with Western passivity. HE1 on books and reading. My teachers were on the side of getting me to write more than read, though in our culture I see more of it the other way. There is no shortage of content. Yes, everybody is literally interviewing everybody else in our culture. I'm not somebody who thinks you've got to produce instead of, sorry for the awful word, consume. I'm more somebody who thinks you've got to consume high quality. So I'm not somebody who that much regrets that, middle class people don't practice the piano. I actually think that listening to a high quality music recording is better than playing the piano on a shit level. Can you analyze Putin's reaction to Zelensky's open letter? Perhaps not in depth in this video, but roughly, Putin thinks that eventually he's going to win and that Zelensky, hopefully, ought not matter. But he's beginning to have second thoughts about that. He's beginning to worry that he might need to deal with Zelensky, but his aspiration is still that he won't, because eventually he'll grind Ukraine down and be able to negotiate on his own terms. I think I discussed this in one of the recent videos on the chat channel. Surely. Let me just check. Putin's Baltic folder. Maybe I discussed it in Putin's Baltic folder. A little bit. This issue, I'll discuss it more. Could you compare how people in Iran, Russia, and Belarus live under authoritarianism? Well, there are going to be very, 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 very many differences. Russia is the most depoliticized of the three countries by far. Belarus and Iran are much more politicized. The politicization in Belarus is more directed toward liberal democracy than the politicization in Russia and Iran. Belarus and Russia are largely secular societies, whereas Iran is not. I mean, this is not an answer. We can go on, but I mean, get yourself going and think of contrasts and comparisons. Will Putin eventually absorb Belarus? Well, Belarus is, and is there a risk of a Ukraine scenario? Not a great risk of a Ukraine scenario, because Belarus is essentially controlled um, by Moscow in all kinds of deep ways. So by the time the Russians lose that control over Belarus, they're going to be too weak to do a Ukraine on Belarus. So that's why I would say that scenario is unlikely. But you couldn't rule it out 30 years from now as some kind of further convulsion on the course of Russia's imperial decline. What you've got in Belarus is a latent but already articulated consciousness of the illegitimacy of their government. And that clearly is suppressed. But you have a civic declaration and palpable civic declaration in Belarus of the kind you don't have in Russia about the illegitimacy of the regime. This is not an energy drink. This is purely sparkling water, and I'm sorry that I'm drinking from weird containers. That's for health reasons, that I'm not being good to the climate. Let's run till the 2-hour mark. What's the deal, Zats TV is asking, with the media intensifying the message that Ukraine is winning last month, and the Zelensky letter at the same time as something going on behind the curtains? What's the deal with Ukraine winning? So there are certain things Ukraine is succeeding at, and there are certain things that the Russians are failing at that are palpable. The Russians have run into a problem where the technological nature of the war means that hypothetically numbers might not make as much of a difference as they could have done several years ago, even if the Russians do another wave of mobilization. The Russians are now being struck deep inside their territory. What Ukraine is not quite managing to do is to deliver these strikes with a kind of repetitiveness that would bar Russia from repairing the damage and getting things back online after damage is incurred. But nevertheless, Ukraine has expanded its capacity to prosecute a war on Russian soil. So Russia is doing badly on some measures, and Ukraine is doing well on some measures that we can see. The problem is that people have lost perspective in the pro-Ukrainian bubble about where this leaves the cumulative balance of advantages and disadvantages. That still is ambiguous, and certainly on balance doesn't favor Ukraine more than Russia. You have to be objective about this. You also have to be objective about particular things that are likely missing from your information environment, right? Notice this. In your information environment, you're constantly seeing, as per the Ukrainian state's information campaign, about all of the terroristic attacks that the Russians do, which harm civilians. You're hearing less about Russian attacks on military targets. You're hearing less even of Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure when civilians are not directly hit. Part of the reason for that is that covering that would expose the extreme weakness and vulnerability of Ukraine. So, things about how difficult the situation is for Ukraine are underplayed in your info bubble. Things about how difficult things are for Russia are overplayed in your info bubble. So it's difficult to get the right balance here. But that doesn't make it false that Russia is doing objectively worse on certain measures. And that doesn't make it false that Ukraine is doing well and better on certain objective measures. It's just that you mustn't make a mistake when you convert these observations into that cumulative balance of strength and weakness, advantage and disadvantage. So I'm beginning to fade more, beautiful community. So we're going to call it a day. It's been lovely to have a smaller group. Thank you so, so much for being with me. I look forward to seeing you soon on chat, but also hopefully in a few days on the main channel as well. Happy Saturday. Lots of love and catch you soon.